Hello, this is the third video in my series on the problem solving and modelling task from the Queensland Mathematics syllabuses. In this, the third video, we want to review the nature of problem solving. We want to look at understanding how to complete the evaluate stage of the flowchart, as well as understanding how to communicate in your report, how to structure it, what sort of appropriate vocab that you need to use, and then how to organise that language coherently and concisely. If we go to the syllabus, we can see that it says problem solving in mathematical modelling is not usually linear and involves an iterative process. This is because when we get a solution, we need to evaluate its reasonableness. In the real world, for a real world problem, there's no right answer to check. There's no perfect design or solution. We need to consider whether the solution we've come up with is valid for the context. And we need to check that we've actually solved the problem we were asked to solve. One way we can do that is by considering alternative methods of solution. Can we verify the results we've obtained? We could consider whether that solution we've obtained is useful in the real-world context that we were given. We also need to think about those simplifying assumptions. What effect do they have on the model, the method of solution, the decisions we've made, and hence the results we've obtained? Even if we're happy that our solution is valid, can we improve the model? Would we get a better solution? Okay, let's go to your PSMT. By now, you should have formed a model, chosen a method of solution, and solved your problem. If we're going to evaluate that process, we need to start at the beginning. So step one, we're going to consider the assumptions and observations. What assumptions did you make when you simplified that real-world scenario that you were given into a mathematical model? How valid were they? How likely are those assumptions to be true? Now, what would the effect be if they weren't the case? Consider the data that you've used. How valid is it? Was there any bias in your sources or in your experiment design? Was there better software that you could have used? Step two, we want to consider the strengths and limitations. How useful is your model in representing the real life scenario? How useful is the solution you'd obtained in terms of the context? How reliable is your method? And then consider those limitations of the simplifying assumptions or the techniques that you used. Were there better procedures? And what evidence do you have? For strengths and limitations, you need to supply evidence of the decisive information that you've used or supporting sources, which would be references. Finally, you need to make an appraisal and answer the question, is your solution reasonable? To do that, you have to weigh up those strengths and limitations that you've just documented and consider the implication of your assumptions. Determine the merit of the results you've obtained by using some criteria, and consider the significance of any possible refinements. But you end up having to make a judgment about your model, your method, and your solution. Also in the evaluate section, you need to justify decisions. So you need to use mathematical reasoning, and that's involves your use of language. You need to be writing in a logical manner, and the structure of the language, your paragraphs and your sentences, is critical there. You can justify your decisions throughout your assignment. So you would have had to justify your selection of procedures in the modelling process as well as in the solve process. But you do need to be justifying in your evaluation as well. Okay, the final step in the process, communicate. So if we're going to look at a PSMT, what is it going to look like? Well, the requirements here are that you have an introduction. You will then have a body of your reports, which will have several different headings or subheadings, and then you'll have a conclusion. Your introduction needs to do two things. It needs to describe what the task is about, and then it needs to outline what you intend to do about the problem. Now, you need to write that in such a way that it's independent of the task sheet. That means the reader can pick up your work, understand what the context was and what the problem is, and also what are you going to do about it. The conclusion then is also about the same size, about half a page, and in that you need to summarise what the task was about and what you've done about it. What were your results and what was your evaluation of your results? You may wish to make recommendations. The body of your task then will depend on the nature of the task, but you will have subheadings and headings, you will have pictures and diagrams and equations, and potentially appendices as well. When writing your report, it's important to consider the words that you use. Firstly, the technical vocab. So in the unit of study in the syllabus, it will have in the subject matter a lot of mathematical terminology. You need to be using the appropriate terminology in your assignment. Make sure you're spelling them correctly, but make sure you're using them correctly as well. If you're not sure of their meaning, at the end of each syllabus is a glossary. So you can look up the keywords from your topic or subtopic in the glossary to get the official definition. On the screen, you'll notice there's also a number of terms there that relate to the PSMT. It's worth reading through those. This document will be available on the Realm page. As well as your technical vocab, there's also procedural vocab that you need to use. And these are the more generic mathematical terms that you would have picked up across your years of study. Make sure you're using mathematical terminology as much as is appropriate, but be consistent with your use. Try to avoid using any slang terms, but instead use correct mathematical terminology. Also important in writing is your use of conventions. There are two types we'll look at. First, you need to be using appropriate English conventions. This is a piece of extended writing, and so you need to be using correct formal grammar. You need to consider your spelling, punctuation, your paragraph structure. When typing, you need to make sure your text is aligned left and that you've included in-text citations where appropriate. Make sure diagrams, pictures and appendices are labelled so that the reader can move back and forth within your report. When writing, don't start a sentence with a number or with an algebraic symbol. We also want to look at mathematical conventions. You will need to be using mathematical reasoning. You will have symbols. You'll most likely have algebraic equations. So when writing algebraically, make sure your equal signs are aligned. Make sure your equations then are aligned to the center. If you're using graphs, make sure you've labeled not only the graph, but the axes on the graph. Make sure any symbols that you do use have been used appropriately. And if you're using variables in your working, make sure you define them before they suddenly appear. And as a tip there, words and algebra don't usually mix well. So avoid putting words into an equation and avoid putting equations into your paragraphs. Keep it clear on the page where you're writing and where you're working mathematically. With those things in mind, if we look at language in a general sense, you have two clear goals. First of all, precision. Every mathematical statement needs to be precise. It needs to have a particular meaning. Every term and every mathematical symbol is well defined. You need to make sure that your reader can understand exactly what you mean and not be confused. For each sentence that you write, consider what exactly is the point of this sentence. What point am I trying to convey? Why is this true? Your second goal is clarity. You need to write clearly so that your readers can understand the points that you're making and follow the sequence of thinking throughout your report. It needs to be clear how the sections in the body of your report link together. You want to try to showcase with your use of language the mastery of the mathematics that you have, showing that you have a depth of understanding. So you can skip the more basic steps and focus on the key decision-making processes. But get to the point. So don't fluff around with lots of big words, don't try to sound clever, and there's no need to try to entertain the reader. Write concisely. In the final video, I'm going to look at some sample tasks, and we can work through the whole process together. But now, if we review the learning goals for this video, hopefully you've got an understanding of that iterative nature of problem solving. You understand how to complete the evaluate stage of the flowchart and how to communicate in your PSMT. Remember, your week 2 goal is to have a completely finished draft. You need to upload that on time to Realm for your teacher's feedback. Remember that the quality of your feedback is going to depend on the quality of the draft that you submit. Now in week 3, while your teacher is marking your draft, I suggest you find someone else who has finished and review each other's work. Then, when you do get your teacher's feedback, read through it carefully and make the suggested changes. But now, as you start writing your draft, remember that secret to success. Set high standards for yourself. Be organised and manage your time well this week. Be aware of your progress and be resilient to overcome the challenges that pop up this week.